welcome back to Web3 Deep Dive Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Wolfson. I'm so excited for today's episode. Today, I'll be speaking with two people. I'll be speaking with Blake Benthall. He is the founder of Fathom X. He is also the founder and he was the former creator of Silk Road 2.0. I'll also be speaking with Vincent Diagnosto. He is a former FBI agent who actually arrested Blake about 10 years ago in San Francisco for starting Silk Road 2.0. So this is a super interesting story. Definitely stay tuned for the whole episode. Before getting started with today's episode, I'd also like to thank the House of Web3 and Edge and Node for letting me film at this beautiful podcasting space in San Francisco. Okay, without further ado, let's get started with today's interview. Hi, Blake. Hi, Vincent. How are you guys doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, well, good to have you guys on. Good to see both of you. Before we get started, I want to kind of give our listeners a little bit of an idea about what you guys do, who you are. So Blake, I'll have you start if you can just introduce yourself briefly, and then Vincent, I'll have you introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Blake. I made a huge life mistake 10 years ago and rebuilt and relaunched the Silk Road 2 Darknet marketplace. Thankfully landed back on my feet, but love cryptocurrency still. I think it's way too hard to build safely and know you're following the rules when using crypto. So I have a new startup called FathomX, which helps builders build confidently.
Great, wonderful. And Vincent, I'm going to call you Vinny for short. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, that's fine. Vincent D'Agostino here. I'm a former FBI agent from the FBI New York office. I spent my first 7 years working Italian organized crime in New York City, then switched over to cyber. The cyber division within the New York office is where I went down my Bitcoin rabbit hole in around 2012. I ended up becoming the case agent for the Silk Road 2 investigation and arrested Blake in San Francisco in 2014.
Wow. Okay. So this is a crazy story, and I want Blake to start from the beginning because I want our listeners to really understand what's going on here. So Blake, tell us your story. Tell us about Silk Road 2.0 and how that came about.
Yeah, so I've always been into programming, even as a kid. I decided to drop college and move to San Francisco to follow my tech dreams. And I was in and out of a few different early stage startups that just never really worked out. That's the way it goes. Most startups fail. And I was kind of at a low point when the federal government took down Silk Road 1 and I heard about it happening. So I jumped on the Silk Road 1 forums and saw what the community was talking about. It was fascinating, and I kind of went down the rabbit hole. Ended up getting in contact with one of the former staff members and was tempted to relaunch the forum at first. Which led to, of course, being convinced to kind of co-found the new marketplace and relaunch it as well. So rebuilt it in about 3 weeks. It was crazy exciting on the technical challenge front, but just quickly snowballed out of control. At one point, I felt like I needed to take over leadership from the other guy. I couldn't really trust the user's money with anyone else. So I assumed leadership for a bit, but I had moved to San Francisco to join the tech industry, not to run a darknet marketplace, and suddenly found myself at the helm of the largest narcotics marketplace at the time. So 1 year later, I was arrested by the FBI and met Vinny here. And that was a terrible day, but in many ways also a relief because I had been really looking for any way out of that possible. And I really think getting caught in the way that I did was actually the only real ethical way out, was to go down with the ship, to completely fail at what I'd set out to build. But ultimately, that year wasn't me. And here we are nearly a decade later, and I'm building to de-risk the crypto ecosystem.
Right. And we'll get to that soon. So Blake, was it 2014 when you were in San Francisco and you started Silk Road 2.0? And then is this when everything kind of happened?
Yeah, I launched November 2013. We got a ton of signups right away. There's a lot of press, and most of the code that a software engineer builds is never used. So it actually was a weird rush to finally have millions of users flocking on to something I've built. I got really focused on that technical aspect of it. But yeah, that was 2013, and then I was arrested 1 year later in November 2014.
Okay. And for our listeners that may not know, Silk Road was a dark website that sold illegal drugs. Am I explaining it correctly?
Yeah, the academic term is crypto market. So it's a site that allows people to use cryptocurrencies to buy and sell mostly narcotics. We tried to keep it really moderated. We had a staff of 12 anonymous staff members, one of whom ended up being an undercover agent. I have no clue if I hired the same person 2 or 3 times. Like managing an anonymous staff is a whole list of topics for a future conversation. But yeah, we really tried to keep it well moderated, and it was mostly narcotics.
Yeah, what was novel, Rachel, from law enforcement perspective, for those that don't know, is that these websites existed within the Tor network, which was an anonymizing network, ironically created by the government way back in the 70s, that people began hosting websites on the dark web within Tor, which made it incredibly difficult for law enforcement to get attribution, meaning if you hosted a website on the surface web, it's very easy to identify who owns that, who's paying for it, and where it's physically located. When it exists on the dark web, it's basically, or up to that point was believed impossible to actually locate where these servers were physically residing. Therefore, you couldn't get search warrants, you couldn't figure out who was running them. So these markets started popping up around 2012, and Silk Road being the most prolific at the time, and also the first site that actually used Bitcoin in exchange for something tangible, which was also a novel theory at the time, a novel premise at the time.
Yeah. So Vinny, that's interesting. Tell us a little bit about how you found Blake, how you discovered Silk Road 2.0.
Yeah. So as Blake mentioned, on the back end of the Silk Road 1 investigation, the Silk Road 2 website went up very, very quickly. I remembered it being a matter of weeks, but I think, Blake, you were saying it might have been a little bit longer than that. But it was quick nonetheless when it went back up, which makes sense because this is all virtual. So it's not like people have to find a new clubhouse or a new headquarters. They can just put up another website. All the users from Silk Road 1 that didn't get scared off or arrested migrated over to Silk Road 2. So it was pretty logical that this was going to happen. And so we began the investigation, immediately seeing that the Silk Road 2 website went up. Fortunately for us, there was, as Blake mentioned, an undercover who had operated within the Silk Road 1 administration who migrated over to the Silk Road 2 site. So you'd have the equivalent of an undercover now that doesn't have to be exposed because they're anonymous. They had their credibility based on their username. So that person who was an HSI agent basically migrated over to Silk Road 2 and was giving us information, giving the FBI information as to what was going on how the site was being rebuilt and, what was going on in the internal workings. So that's where it all started from.
Okay, got it. And then, so did you come out to San Francisco, and were you the one who arrested Blake actually? Or was that someone? Yeah.
No, that was me, but that was like a year later. I mean, in the interim, you have to still figure out, of course, who these people are. Again, like I said, this was all operating on the dark web, so there was a lot of technical investigation that went into that part of it, as well as some traditional search warrants and subpoenas that were served once we started narrowing the list down to potential people that could have been Defcon, which was the screen name that Blake was using. They became pretty obvious at that point because out of those handful of people that we narrowed it down to, there was only one that was a developer. There was only one that was keenly interested in Bitcoin, and there was only one that would really fit the profile of somebody who would have the skill set to even do this. So at that point, we had a pretty good indication that it was more than likely, Blake who was operating the site.
Got it. So Blake, after you were arrested, what happened?
Yeah, I mean, that was a terrible, terrible day. In a very selfish year in my personal life. I mean, I had run the site for a year with no family or friends having any clue that I was doing it. And there's a lot of collateral damage and people that were hurt through that. So right after my arrest, I was thrown into solitary confinement in Alameda County, and that was for about 2 weeks. and it just completely broke me. You don't realize how many hours there really are in the day until, especially growing up on the internet and growing up always with an electronic device on you. Yeah, I think I'll forever have some mental reverberations from those 2 weeks. But eventually, got transferred to a New York facility and spent around 8 months in jail. At day one, a judge told me I was facing a mandatory minimum of 10 years to life. And that's just one of the moments that your life stops. Everything changes. So over the span of those 8 months, I kind of saw it as a hackathon for my life. Like any chance I had to pitch a federal agent on, hey, let me be useful. Here's some stuff I could build. Here's some things I could teach about the modern tech stack and about cryptocurrency. I was pitching like crazy, which I'm a lifelong entrepreneur, and I just always kind of default into trying to make the best of any situation. And I'm very grateful that some people listened to my, cry for a second chance.
So when you say some people listened to your cry for a second chance, what happened? I mean, obviously you're not in jail now. You have a new company that we're going to talk about, but what happened exactly?
Yeah, I come from a middle-class family. My parents stood by my side the whole time and poured most of their retirement into my legal defense. So kind of from me campaigning on the inside and my attorney campaigning outside, it resulted in a very rare opportunity to be released on bail 8 months after being incarcerated. So I then put my head down. I had an ankle tracker on, was living in New York City and helping on anything they needed help with, and working essentially for free to pay off my mistake.
With the FBI, right?
Decade.
With the FBI.
Correct.
The way it works is that there's a decision made by myself and the other agent at the time to whether or not to pitch Blake to see if he was amenable to figuring out an alternative solution to dying in jail potentially. And that's based on the things that you learn about the person before the arrest happens. So if it's a kind of person, when I worked organized crime, for example, there were plenty of people that I knew were just not going to be amenable to that. And there wasn't any point in trying to work something out. Blake being on the other kind of end of the spectrum of that, I viewed him as a builder and somebody who is, lost sight of the things that he was building, or what the end use was for the thing that he was building, but was more interested in that part of it than any ideological, beliefs behind it. So when we went out to San Francisco, there was a conversation that happened at the time of arrest in his bedroom about, this is the fork in the road, and which way do you want to try? And that involves us putting some faith in him, and him putting a lot of faith in us to say, well, then what can I do to then assist? And the way I looked at it was there wasn't a ton that I think Blake could provide us in terms of additional evidence regarding that case or that site. I mean, it's very different than traditional crime. He doesn't have the ability to point a finger at somebody. He doesn't know who they are. But I knew he was a fantastic builder, and that was in short order at the FBI at the time, and I'm sure to this day, meaning it's very difficult to bring people in that have those skill sets who can build phenomenal tools quickly and efficiently. It may not be a shock to some people, but like there's a lot of bureaucracy in the Bureau of Investigation. And so having somebody who can come in and bypass a lot of that and say, okay, well, I know you have the skills to do it. So here's a lot of data. What could you do to build a framework around this data to make it accessible for us? And that's where, he was very interesting to me as somebody who could provide assistance like that. That's very different than most people who provide that kind of assistance, by the way, because normally it's go back out on the street and like wear a wire type of assistance. That he had no value. Blake had no value in that regard. It was his building skills that actually brought value to the value proposition from the FBI's perspective. At least that's how I saw it.
So Blake, when you were, thank you, Vinny. That's interesting. Blake, when you were working with the FBI and working with Vinny, were you identifying illicit crypto use cases?
Yeah, technology's been moving so fast, especially over the past decade. So I arrived at a time when concepts that seem really familiar to us today were very new. So Bitcoin itself, cryptocurrency itself, there was a lot of opportunity to educate. We talk a lot about educating the regulators today in our industry, but I had the chance to educate a lot of enforcers into how to investigate Bitcoin and how to not jump to conclusions in those investigations. Then also, like, there's just a lot of opportunity in the modern cloud stack to, the way we build software today and launch it is so different from, putting it all in one server, where traditionally the government may go, take a server out of the rack and be like, okay, we've got everything. But these days with cloud architecture, you'll get, 300 to 1,000, huge amounts of hard drive images from a lot of results. So in many ways, the projects were really an honor to work on, and there's a lot of educational opportunity, which I encourage builders today to open their minds to thinking of ways to better educate people on the other side of the fence, because there are a lot of misunderstandings about the core technology, and that it's not for crime. Technology is agnostic to good or evil. It's just technology. So I love when builders cross the fence and help their regulators and help their enforcers.
Definitely. Okay, so this is where the story gets interesting. So Blake, you started a company recently called Fathom X. Can you tell our listeners about Fathom X and what you're now doing?
Yeah, it's been really an honor, and I have so much gratitude to have made it through that journey. It's not lost on me that not many people get the opportunity that I got. So I still see it as being way too easy to go wrong in crypto, both as a builder, but as an investor or as a business. So FathomX helps businesses prove that they really have the assets they claim to have, and that they can still access those assets, and the assets didn't come from anywhere illicit. So we're trying to make it practically impossible to scam in the crypto space, and especially to be dishonest to investors. So situations like FTX should be impossible, because blockchains, one of their greatest advantages is that they're public. It's a public ledger. So if a company claims to have billions of dollars in assets across different chains, the next question should be, okay, in which addresses? So with FathomX, anyone can plug in a huge list of addresses and monitor where a business stands from a compliance standpoint. And we believe every business at some point will hold cryptocurrency. That's inevitable. So now's the time to get ahead of it and to de-risk the whole ecosystem.
Cool. Okay, we'll talk more about that in a minute. Vinny, back to you. It's also interesting because you're, you believe in FathomX, you believe in Blake. I think you're an investor in the company. So how did that happen?
Yeah, there was a lot of time in between. So I was there for about a year after arresting Blake, and I felt like the initial year was very, very critical, because it was figuring out, like, okay, we have this person who's willing to assist. I want him to assist. What's the best use for him? And how do I position him in a way that he has legs, meaning he can do this long beyond when I'm gone. Although I wasn't thinking about really leaving at that time, I knew that the bureau can be kind of crazy, and who knows, I can get transferred to Alaska the next week. So I think it was getting him in a position to get involved in some really fun projects that, as he said, was kind of a way for him to showcase his ability. And then I left about a year after that, and I knew he was in very good hands with the agents that were taking over handling him. And we kept in touch, like, I don't know, probably at that point, talk a few times a year, but always kept in touch, because I became, friendly with his attorney, and obviously my old friends at the FBI I still kept in touch with. So it would always be, I would always inquire and see how he was doing. And then it really wasn't until years later, 7 years later after I left the FBI, that the end was in sight for him, meaning that he had provided enough assistance where there was the conversation about what's the next step for him, what's going to happen to him. And that's entirely up to a judge. But I knew that because he had been doing so well and staying out of any kind of trouble, that the odds were good that he was going to get a second chance. And so I think that's when, the conversations with Blake started turning towards, so, like, what do you do when you're someone in his situation, right? Like you go pay your debt, and in the movies you come out and it's like, what, like you start a job at a bank or something? Like what do you do with this background, this history? And so I think that's when the discussions about like what is in the market. And as I mentioned, I went down the rabbit hole in 2012. So I started mining Bitcoin in 2013. I mined for many years from my home. It was a technology I was incredibly skeptical about, coming from the FBI side of it initially, that I absolutely fell in love with and went completely 180 on. So for me, as a a true believer in the technology and what it can do to fix the money, there's such a demand right now for empowering individuals and corporations to get more comfortable with using Bitcoin without the fear that it's used for ransomware or it's used for drugs, these sort of negative connotations that are going to take decades to sort of cleanse themselves from. So anytime we would come up with an idea of saying, what would be beneficial, to me, always top of mind was, OFAC checks, right? Office of Foreign Asset Control. Like you have companies that want to operate in this, but they don't want to get in trouble. How do they know where this Bitcoin's coming from? How do they know that it's clean? What about from the individual level, right? When the ETFs were announced earlier this year, and you have the likes of BlackRock and Fidelity dumping hundreds of billions, ultimately trillions in, for the first time ever, users have the ability to audit a Fidelity, to audit a BlackRock and say you have all this money safe. Where are the wallets? And we can have services that track that. So if there's any kind of anomalous activity in and around that, it can protect the consumers. And some companies like Bitwise are leaning very heavy into that, providing those addresses right out of the gate. I think that's the future of finance. I think that's the future of investment, is that it's no longer we're trusting a company to not cook the books. We finally have the technology through Bitcoin to be able to actually audit every 10 minutes if we want to, right? Every block that's settled, we have the ability to audit those transactions to verify that the money is where they say it is. We don't have to wait for an economic collapse to find out that your money has been lent out to something, foolish or whatever. So I think that's where the idea sort of stemmed from, was increasing the visibility, giving tools to the average person or average company to make their transition into understanding and ultimately utilizing Bitcoin a lot easier. That was the attraction for me, at least.
Yeah. Blake, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity to educate consumers and businesses still on how little privacy there is in cryptocurrency. Banks and governments are using really powerful tools to trace everything you're doing. I like to compare it to the early days of the internet, where we didn't understand that what you say on social media might follow you around for the rest of your life. But people are making financial mistakes, often using cryptocurrency for their most embarrassing purchases and transactions. And those are forever immortalized on public blockchains. So every cryptocurrency address also has kind of a risk score attached to it by different compliance tools. But we're at a point where consumers around the world and businesses have no way to actually see if their money's flagged. Let's say you're a coffee shop, you accept Bitcoin, and some drug dealer comes in and buys coffee from you. You put your Bitcoin into a major exchange, your account's going to get frozen because all of that's extremely traceable, but you don't have access to the tools that banks and governments are using. So ultimately, that's what FathomX is building. Yes, we want to see the assets a business claims to have, but we also want to see what metadata and what traceability is attached to everyone's money. We want to raise awareness to, like, you should have an explanation for every digital asset you receive, because your exchange, your bank, and your government can see way more about it than you do.
Right. This is a question for both of you. I think there's this misconception in the world that Bitcoin and cryptocurrency is a better tool for criminals to use because it's not traceable. But would you say that crypto is probably, like, a criminal, if they were to choose between fiat money and crypto, like they would probably want to choose money, right? Does that make sense? I mean, what are your takes on that?
Yeah, so I'll go first from kind of my experience. One of the reasons I went from organized crime to cyber was because I saw that the future in all of this, good, bad, and ugly, was going to happen digitally. And that was always a core interest of mine anyway. The Colombo organized crime family was not getting involved in Bitcoin, right? That was something that's going to be, they're going to die a slow death because new organized crime is being committed digitally. And if it's going to be committed on the internet, they're going to use the internet of money, which is Bitcoin. But as Blake has said earlier, right, that's like saying, well, now we have cars and bank robberies are being committed by people on cars instead of horses. So it must be the cars must be evil. It's a ridiculous way to look at it. When telephones were invented and organized crime got into telephone scams, nobody said, well, telephones are evil. It's just that criminals have a tendency to look at a technology and find a way earlier than normal adoption would occur for regular people to find ways to do bad things with it. So someone invents email, and the average person says, this is cute, I can send the message from here to there. And a bad guy says, I can pretend to be a Nigerian prince and scam some old lady in Cincinnati out of her life savings. Normal people don't think that way. Criminals think that way. Engineers certainly don't think that way. So to me, it's kind of ironic because the fact that we have criminals using something like Bitcoin is an endorsement rather than a detraction from it, because they're going to pick the best tools that they have, the most solvent tools, the most reliable tools to do what they do. It should be an indication to the rest of the market that if there's something there that they're using for bad, we can probably use it for good with a 10 or 20x impact on our businesses. If a bad guy is going to participate in a crime outside of something like ransomware, yes, the majority of these things are happening with fiat currency. That's not going to change for a very, 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 very long time. And as far as the traceability, something like Bitcoin is anonymous until it's not. And when I say that, I mean, it's really great until they figure out who you are. And then every single transaction can be traced back to you definitively with no argument that the books have been manipulated, because there it is in the blockchain. So if you're using a wallet with 100 addresses to commit crimes and you get away with it for 10 years, that's great. But the minute they figure out those addresses belong to you and that wallet is found in your laptop in your house, it's almost impossible now to say, I didn't do it. Whereas with fiat, you have wiggle room to say, well, that was cash and I took some cash out and I gave it to this person and I don't know where it ended up. It's a lot less traceable when it comes to that. But I think people need to change the way they look at it and say, just like, the phone and the car and the internet itself, is that you're going to have a criminal element that's going to adopt those things for malicious purposes long before the regular people realize we can build an Amazon on this technology. That doesn't mean that it's something that is inherently bad. And frankly, it usually means that it's the opposite.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll add that no one should commit crime using cryptocurrency. That's one of the dumbest ways to possibly make money in cryptocurrency. You should quit your job and start a startup in the crypto industry. Like, there's so many opportunities to build still. And I'll forever regret, launching Silk Road 2.0 using Bitcoin instead of just starting a Bitcoin company in 2013. But it's still the early days of cryptocurrency. It's just like the early days of the internet, where the list of startups, from the 90s and early 2000s, we can barely even remember. And some of those had multi-billion-dollar valuations and IPO'd. We still haven't found the Google of the crypto industry, and it's not too late to start it. So don't commit crime with cryptocurrency. Sit down and build for good with it.
Totally. Exactly. And I mean, gosh, to use Bitcoin to build a website in 2013, I mean, imagine if you still had that Bitcoin today. The price would right now the price is a little bit low, but you know what I'm saying. Low, right? It's not that low.
Yeah, exactly. Low.
Right. 56K today or whatever it is, low. It's not low.
In our squad area, when we were talking about the discussion of Bitcoin mining came up, it was just around $100, I remember, and most of us were convinced we missed it. There's no reason to mine. I mine just for the educational component of it. I just mined to see how Bitcoin was generated through a pool and how it presented on the blockchain. I had no belief that it would ever be worth anything down the road. But at $100, I tell people we thought we missed it. So when I hear people say I missed it at 50,000 or 60, I'm like, yeah, I felt that way all the way on the way up, until you kind of let Bitcoin humble you and realize that it's going up probably forever. And so you better get on board sooner rather than later.
Totally. So I know we're running low on time. Blake, what is your ultimate goal? I mean, what do you want to see happen moving forward with yourself, with Fathom X, with the crypto industry?
Yeah, I'm just so excited to be able to build in the open finally. I had a secret life for a year and had the fortunate, rare opportunity to build for nearly a decade to pay off the mistake. But that was also a secret life. It's projects I can't really talk about. So on a personal level, I'm just so thrilled to be back at it in the public sphere and able to build and release. And I really believe it's not too late to start the Google of the cryptocurrency industry. I think there's so much room for innovation. The user experience is terrible across the map, and cryptocurrency right now is hurting a ton of people. It's way too easy to get scammed using cryptocurrency, especially for non-tech savvy people. So my real goal with my company, with Fathom X, is to make scamming practically impossible on blockchains and build from there.
Okay, cool. That's wonderful. Vinny, any final thoughts that you want to share? Any goals you hope to see achieved in the crypto industry, or what you're hoping for?
No, I think with mainstream adoption happening in 2024 via the ETFs, we're talking now about major presidential candidates appearing at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville. Blake and I were there a few weeks ago. To hear they had 6 senators there, several candidates, including Trump, speaking about adopting Bitcoin and either putting it as a strategic reserve asset by holding the Bitcoin they have, or potentially with Cynthia Lummis proposing buying more Bitcoin to create a Bitcoin strategic reserve for the U.S. government. I mean, these were like fantastical, ridiculous concepts back in 2012. And so it has come so far. And I think the next iteration is going to involve, I hate the R word, but some form of regulation or consistency with the regulation, so people aren't guessing what the SEC thinks is right or wrong. We have an understanding that if you want to add Bitcoin to your balance sheet, these are the tools that you can incorporate, including the tools that are being built by Fathom X, to help protect yourself and your organization, to minimize the risk, so that people can participate in this revolution. And that's what I hope to see over the next couple of years, is people getting those tools in house, people understanding it better and getting more comfortable being the next MicroStrategies and putting it on your balance sheet for your company, and nation states will follow soon by adding it as a strategic reserve. So it's very exciting times.
It is. And I hope you guys are doing your part to educate regulators and to get them to learn about, crypto and Fathom X, and to work with these companies to ensure that they're properly regulated, because that's the way the industry is moving forward. That's the way it's maturing. And the U.S. has to be a leader in that.
100%.
Cool. Any final thoughts before we end the show?
On my side, I just encourage people to be careful when they're getting into it. Like, if you're not tech savvy, you probably shouldn't be using cryptocurrency at this state. I talked to a ton of crypto scam victims, and there are just some really heartbreaking stories out there. So, things that seem too good to be true probably are, and I just encourage people to be careful in the ecosystem.
Cool. Vinny, any final thoughts?
Nope, good on my end.
Okay. If our listeners want to follow you guys or follow Fathom X, are you guys on X, or are you on LinkedIn or social media?
Yeah, we're FathomX _ on X. You got that edgy underscore at the end. And you can find each of our profiles by looking at the company feed.
Yeah,
okay,
I'm on
wonderful.
X as proof of work 1, the number 1.
Wonderful. Okay, cool. Well, thank you both for your time. It's been wonderful, and hope to see you guys in person at a crypto event soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel.
Special thanks to 4 Labs Digital for producing Web3 Deep Dive podcast. I'd also like to thank the sponsors behind Web3 Deep Dive. You can click the links in the show notes to learn more about each of the Web3 initiatives from these sponsors. Finally, thanks to the listeners for tuning in. Please be sure to subscribe, like, and share. I'll see you guys next time.